Einen wunderschönen guten Morgen, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren. It's a wonder on a beautiful day to find all of you here. I'm deeply grateful that you've chosen to attend the Burgtheater debate this morning. We have a really full house, as I can see, right up to the top. We've opened almost all the space that Burgtheater could give us. My name is Shalini Randeria. I'm the rector of the Institute for Human Sciences. I would like to take this opportunity not only to thank all of you for being with us, but to thank our three partners, the Burgtheater for allowing a debate here. Friends in New York, when they heard that there is not only a debate, but there is an audience, couldn't believe that anybody in Vienna is attending anything in the public sphere. So this is a remarkable achievement under remarkable, extraordinary circumstances. I would also like to thank Standard, who has been our partner in these debates since many years, and I would also like to express my deep gratitude to the Erste Stiftung, which has been a strategic partner. Boris Mate is unable to be here this morning. He would have actually liked to have greeted you himself, but I greet in his name as well. It is under remarkable circumstances that we are all here, but it is an extraordinary election as well. And when we were students in India, we often used to stay. All of us needed to have two ballots, one to vote in the Indian election, the other in the US election, because all of us had a stake globally in American politics. I think this has never been more true than in the last 4 years. All of us are keeping our fingers crossed as to the results of these elections. And I think the next fortnight is going to be a really interesting one. But before that, the debate will discuss several issues which are related to the election. Two very quick announcements, and one, we are continuing the discussions in the IWM. For those of you who can come to events, they've gone virtual, as you can imagine, but both Eva Vejvoda, the permanent fellow at IWM, who will be your moderator this morning, and I have podcasts, which we have started in order to reach out to the audience differently in these days. Mine on Democracy in Question started 2 weeks ago. It's a fortnightly podcast. Tim Snyder, who's the IWM Permanent Fellow, who's one of the participants in the panel today, is the first person who opens my podcast series talking about the deeper pathologies of American democracy rather than the Trumpian blip on which so many people are focused these days. Ivan Vejvoda's podcast is on Europe's futures. It'll be a monthly one. Mine is a fortnightly one. And for those of you who would like to come back to the Burgtheater with us, the next Burgtheater debate, which all four of us partners will hold, is in January. I will moderate it. It'll be in German. It's on the vaccine, so it'll be about the Covid-Impfung, Ware oder Gemeingut. We look forward to this morning's debate, and thank you very, very much for being with us today.
Well, good morning and a very warm welcome from me as well. This is a real miracle that we're all here today, knowing that Paris is locked down in curfew for the next weeks and even maybe until the end of the year. And the fact that there wasn't any announcement abruptly yesterday morning that we can't congregate, it's really wonderful, as Shalini said, that we are able to be here together. This election, and of course the name of this series is Debating Europe, or Europa im Discourse, is about Europe, but as she said, the US affects us all. As you have all seen, the early wave of enthusiastic early voting in the US, I'm sure that many people here would like to go out and vote. as Shalini said, to help redress some of the things that have happened in the transatlantic arena, but we can't. So what we can do is highlight some of the key questions that have been troubling the world and Europe and the European American elections. It's a great honor and pleasure to welcome the distinguished panelists that we have today here. And before I give a very short introduction and before we engage the debate, I'd like to present them to you here in alphabetical order, with one exception, of course. I'd like to introduce Ambassador Eva Nowotny here first of all. She is, as some of you may know, the chair of the board of Vienna University, which is one of the biggest universities in Europe, and a distinguished person in her own right. But for the reasons of this panel, more importantly, she is a distinguished Austrian diplomat and has served in many important places as ambassador to France, to the United Kingdom, and as ambassador of Austria to the United States from 2003 to 2007, and also a senior foreign policy advisor to Austrian Chancellor. So welcome, Eva Nowotny. To my right, my friend and our colleague, journalist with the New York Times, who is currently the chief diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times based in Brussels. He has practically traveled the whole world and has been a correspondent or bureau chief with the New York Times, which he joined in 1987, and working for the Boston Globe before that, covering from the Iranian Revolution to Solidarity. He was correspondent for Southeast Asia and Bangkok bureau chief, served in Moscow, in Washington, in the Balkans. That's where we met, actually. He was covering my country, Yugoslavia, when it was bombed in 1999. What a great friendship started then at that difficult time. He was bureau chief in Berlin, Jerusalem, Paris, London, and as I said, is now in Brussels. So welcome to Stephen. Next we have Raimund, our Viennese Austrian colleague here and friend, who started out as a prominent journalist and well-known historian who has written on many interesting things. We realize that we have a common kind of origins in 1968 in Europe in various places. He has worked for the ORF radio and was correspondent in places like the Middle East, covering Latin America, European countries, correspondent in Moscow, covering the Baltics, Caucasus, and was bureau chief in Washington from 91 to 97, and then from 2003 to 2007, and was head of the ORF in Brussels, and most recently, head of ORF in Beijing. And most of you know, since Shalini mentioned podcasts, that he runs a very successful Falter podcast among all the other things that he does. So please welcome Raimund Löw. And last but not least, colleague and friend Timothy Snyder, professor of history at Yale University and permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences, and author of many renowned books, of which I will only mention Bloodlands, that has been translated into 20 languages. Tim is a polyglot. There isn't practically a language that he doesn't cover from here to Moscow and backwards. Also very well known for his books, The Road to Unfreedom and On Tyranny, and his latest book about an unfortunate personal experience that he had. His book is called Our Malady, Lessons in Liberty from a Hospital Diary, already translated into German, which I recommend, the Amerikanische Krankenheit. Maybe that's a fitting title also for the general background of our theme today. As I said, early voting is on. There is an announcement that these might be record-breaking turnout in these elections that hasn't been seen since 1908. The fact that there are so many questions about voter suppression, about mail-in ballots. I mean, we could spend the whole day here discussing all the ramifications that these elections are having on the domestic stage in the US, the issue of the swing states. We are 16 days away from November 3rd. We do not know whether on the morning of November 3rd we will have a clear result. Following the opinion polls, of course, we can extremely cautiously say that it looks like it's going towards a Biden victory, but after what happened in 2016, I think nobody can be 100% sure. But as I said, we are here today to discuss the other aspects of United States politics, the administration of the 45th president, which some of our colleagues call Donald Trump only by that name, the 45th. You don't even want to mention his name, but we can get into all of that later. I'd like to start out by asking Ambassador Nowotny. Eva, you were ambassador at a very difficult moment in US-European relations when the Iraq war was declared, when pommes frites, the French fries, became a huge problem in the United States. How can you compare that situation, that tense situation in transatlantic relations with what you are seeing from your vantage point today?
Thank you very much, Jan. Well, first of all, a very big welcome also to all of you. I'm stunned that so many people have turned out for this discussion, which shows the relevance also of the subject that we are going to discuss. I've been personally following these debates basically since their inception, but mainly on the other side and sitting down there. So being on the stage is a change of perspective, and but I will cope. As you have rightly said in your introduction, I've been in the United States twice on post. The first time from 1978 till 1983, the second time from 2003 till 2008, so 11 years altogether. And if I look back at my time, where I had many visits in between, it spans 40 years, more than 40 years. And in these 40 years, of course, lots of changes have occurred. It would be the natural thing that situations change. It would be very strange if they didn't. When I came back after my first experience in the United States in 2003, it was remarkable to see the change that had occurred in that time. Yeah? When I was in New York with the change from the government of President Carter to President Reagan, which was a big ideological shift. Yeah? But nevertheless, there was always a discussion going on. People wanted to engage you in an exchange. Everybody was interested in listening and debating and so on. And this has changed completely. When I came back in 2003, you had the feeling that there was a polarization. The discourse had broken down. People were no longer talking to each other. There were two camps that were basically hostile and in a hostile competition. And that has gone worse during the last years. Even as somebody who came as an observer and an outsider, it was noticeable because you were confronted with questions trying to identify where you were standing. Were you in our camp or were you in the other camp? And then the moment they discovered in your answers that you were in the other camp, talks broke down. It was a very, very difficult situation. As we are mainly debating Europe here, the image that prevailed during the 70s and the 80s of Europe in the United States, and I'm speaking in a very generalizing way, was sort of this is the very gracious old lady who has lost a little bit of vigor and is no longer so dynamic. But it was basically a positive and a benevolent picture. based on cooperation. In the aftermath of the Iraq War, it was the first time that we really experienced a conscious political endeavor on the part of the United States to split Europe and to divide it into what they called the old Europe and the new Europe. And the new Europe, that was mainly the eastern parts and the new members of the European Union, who were then identified as being more sympathetic also to the Iraq venture and to the more sort of aggressive American politics of that time. While the old Europe, that was Germany, France, Austria also, were sort of the ones who did not go with the administration. French were called the cheese-eating surrender monkeys. Yeah. French fries were transformed into freedom fries. I've seen that myself on many menus and so on. So that was a big break in our relationship. And under the Trump administration, I have to say things have gotten worse. Because here now, and this is also a first, we have seen a conscious endeavor against the European Union, where the European Union was branded as a foe, as an enemy, as a competitor, taking advantage of the United States throughout the decades. We have seen President Trump encouraging Britain on this suicidal adventure of leaving the European Union. He has asked Chancellor Merkel when she would leave the European Union. He has asked Macron when she would leave the European Union. So the European Union was no longer perceived as this automatic partner, which we have been throughout the whole post-war period. And the fact that basically the United States were an instigator and a promoter of European integration has been completely forgotten and pushed into the background. There were, of course, this was not only atmospheric, there were some very serious differences, and I'm sure that we come to them in the course of our discussion. We have a completely different approach to multilateralism. We have a completely different approach to diplomacy, to negotiation, to compromise. And the whole construction of the European Union is based on the art of compromising and finding compromise, sharing sovereignty in order to achieve a common ground and a common goal. And this is very alien to the thinking that in the Trump administration has prevailed. And we saw that right at the beginning of the administration when the new national security doctrine was published, based on an assumption that peace and security is best guaranteed by an interaction of nation states with each other in a kind of a deal-making. And that this is the best guarantor for the maintenance of stability. And that, of course, is something which is a concept which is directly opposed to what European Union and our thinking of diplomatic relations and foreign policy is based on. I leave it at that for the moment.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Eva, for reminding us that there were difficult, very difficult moments, in fact, in the relationship between the United States and Europe, and the Iraq War, as Joseph Stiglitz has called it, the several trillion war, and US troops are still in that region. We'll come to the Middle East a little later. I'd like to turn to you, Steve, now. Again, our colleague and friend Charles Kupchan, who was advisor to Obama on Europe after my former boss Karen Donfried, just published a book on US exceptionalism, a history of the Americans' efforts to shield itself from the world, as the subtitle goes. You have lived through many of these moments, what we call the international rule-based order, which has, for better or for worse, led and framed the world and its relations, has certainly received a blow. Eva reminded us of the way that Trump has tried to weaken and divide Europe. How do you see, from Brussels, you sit at the center of Europe, this issue of exceptional? Are we seeing a U.S. retrenchment with regards to the world?
Thank you very much. I'll just say very, very briefly, it's an incredible honor to be here with this wonderful panel. I won't go on about that because we don't have endless time, but it is an honor, and thank you all for braving the virus and coming out to hear us. Look, the United States is still, to me, an experiment. It may be an experiment that's failing, it may be an experiment that is having difficulties, it may be an aging experiment. The European Union, to me, is an aging experiment that maybe had its best days in the last century, maybe not in this one. But I think one of the biggest things that have happened, not to go back too far into history, First World War, Second World War, we decided to stay to make sure that Europe didn't do again to itself what it did after the First World War, et cetera, et cetera. This we all understand. But I think the collapse of the Soviet Union is the moment that marks a different era, because it changed the American view of itself, it changed the world's view of the stakes, it allowed much more dissent from basically an American hegemony, and yet American power did, I think largely altruistically, allow Europe to recover, to have its 30 glorious years of economic recovery, to rebuild its social systems, and to take its place again with a degree of pride in the world. Now, it was never going to last forever. China was going to rise, Russia was going to change. I mean, things happen, but there's a big debate now in the United States about whether, and Trump in a way exemplifies this debate, which is why should we spend so much treasure and effort on behalf of people who are richer than we and who have bigger economies and who keep talking about strategic autonomy even if they're not doing very much to make it real. And so, is there a retrenchment? Yes, you saw it to begin with under Obama. There was a different definition of what American interests were. Now, you could say some of these things were a mistake, but the Obama administration's decision not to intervene against Bashar al-Assad in Syria, its decision to let its red lines disappear after chemical weapons were used. Personally, I think that was a mistake. It hurt American credibility, but it was a choice made by a president who looked at the Middle East and said, this is absurd, what we're doing here. This is not our problem. This may be Europe's problem, it may be somebody else's problem, it's not our problem. And Trump also played on very strongly, and this is something he felt. I met him in 1988 when he was not thinking of becoming a president. He was very similar to what he is now, but much thinner and more articulate, frankly. But even then, he was complaining about how our allies screw us over. And the Germans and the Japanese have their cars everywhere, and where are our cars? And how American taxpayers are funding the German welfare system. I mean, this is an old theme with him, and it touched a nerve. Demands from the United States that, for example, European allies pay more for their own defense go back to Harry Truman, to be honest, but were very strongly stated by Robert Gates under the Reagan administration. It's been a regular theme. Trump made it real. Trump threatened in his strange way to pull out of NATO. I don't think he would have been allowed to. But he has touched on a sense which I think is real and will outlast his presidency if he is defeated in America, that we no longer have the power, the will, the money to be the world's policeman and to defend everyone else at our own expense. And this is part of what touches the Trump base. I mean, it's aided by globalization, it's aided by the sense that the rise of China is hurting American jobs, it's aided by the fact that working class incomes, middle class incomes in America have been stagnant for 2 decades. It may be aided a bit by the fact that we now have a $3 trillion deficit, partly due to the virus, but there is an element of the United States that will persist, particularly even if Biden wins, because his first attention will be at home, given the virus and given his promises to his own base, that I think America is pulling back to a great degree. The question is, will Europe step up? Does anyone else care? We'll have to see.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stephen. And of course, I didn't mention the fact that you are someone who has braved the virus and took your first flight from Brussels in 7 months, where you have been retrenched doing your chief diplomatic correspondent job. So thank you very much for having the courage to do that, and we hope that your flight back goes well. Raimund, I turn to you. As I mentioned, and I'm sure many people know here, you were of latest assignment in Beijing. And clearly what we've heard both from Eva and Stephen about Trump's policies, and these are not new, as Steve mentioned, from 1988. This is someone who's been thinking in transactional terms. And many pundits have said that we are probably looking at a G2 world, one where US and China kind of piggyback over and jump over Europe. How much, and you were there during part of the Trump administration, how do you see, in terms of global affairs and this rule-based order that is being challenged both by China and the US, how do you think that affects Europe?
Well, I think Europe is affected because the international system is changing, and Europe is part of the international system. The international system is changing because China is coming back as with the self-confidence of a country that has the impression we are the newcomer, we are the power of the future, and all the other world powers are world powers of the past. And that is something that in China, the relationship with America is the most important relation. The country of reference for China is America because of the feeling of competition. The Americans want to prevent us to become a world power. The Americans are engaged in building alliances to encircle us. So there is this feeling we have we see the United States as the example of what should happen or should not happen. It's both, because and of course this feeling of competition is fueled by the nationalist propaganda coming from the leadership, coming from above. But there is another element in the relationship between China and America. The Chinese word for America is Meiguo. It's the beautiful country. And thousands and thousands of well-to-do Chinese sent their kids to study in American universities. And they know very well they send their kids to a different political system. They send their kids where there's a different concept of freedom. And many of these people also would tell you, we hope once these kids come back, they bring a part of this reality in America to our country. When Trump was elected, it was a very contradictory reaction. You had the mainstream, if you can call it the mainstream in China, was less negative and skeptical than in Europe. That was my impression. The idea was, okay, a successful businessman gets in their leadership position, why not? This should happen, this is okay, let's wait and see. For the part of the Chinese public, intellectuals, academics who are following what was happening after that, the reaction was similar to the one in Europe. They were shocked. It was deep shock because suddenly their government, the propaganda people could turn to Trump, to the American president, and continue their theme. Well, the New York Times is fake news. Yeah? The elections are rigged. So the whole idea of the American democratic tradition is undermined by this president, the number one in the US. And this is a shock. And I think one of the most shocking elements of Trumpism, not only in China, also in Europe, was this slogan at the last campaign towards Hillary Clinton, lock her up. It was repeated yesterday in Michigan, in the direction of the governor of Michigan, who had been threatened by a coup attempt, lock her up. And Trump said, you should lock everybody up. And that was a shock for the Chinese, because the Chinese said, well, that's what our people do. Yeah? I mean, if there is a competitor, then he's locked up. That's our system. So how come our system gets now a loudspeaker of our methods sits in Washington, D.C.? Not only that, the fact this kind of delegitimization of opponents. That is the central difference, I think, between Trumpism and other conservative, hardline conservatives had always existed in the United States. The fact that you delegitimize opponents and want to lock them up. That was a shock. And not only the message, lock them up, but the fact that there is a big following. I mean, you probably, Donald Trump is exaggerating the numbers of at his rallies, but they are big rallies. You can't deny that. There is a mass following for this kind of conservatism, radical conservatism, delegitimizing opponents. And that is something new, and I think the Chinese interested academics realize that there is something going on in America that is different from the usual competition between conservatives and liberals. I would, from a European point of view, I would add one more point, because it's shocking. I think this whole Trump experience is shocking. This election campaign is shocking. But America is complicated. There is also something inspiring all the time. For me, it was inspiring in the last weeks to follow the debates on American television. And the town hall meeting in Florida a couple of days ago, because it showed the strength of journalism, with the understanding of journalism as an element of control, the role of journalists not to let yourself be bullied, not to accept lies, to contradict power. And that is a strong tradition in America. And I think it's an expression of the strength of civil society in America, which is a difference between many other countries that have similar tendencies, but a civil society that's weaker. So I was sort of proud of my colleagues from NBC and ABC and even Fox News. It is surprising. I mean, Chris Wallace, the moderator of the first debate, is a moderator of Fox News. I mean, he couldn't really cope with Trump, but that was probably impossible. But he was clearly acting as a journalists and not as a propagandist. And the fact that even Trump, that even Fox News, which is in many shows a loudspeaker of Trump, has bastions of independent journalism, is a sign of hope for me.
Thank you, Raimund. Tim, for this first round and last but not least, and basically linking up to Raymond's last point on the whole issue of politics and democracy, you have so eloquently written in your books on tyranny and the road to unfreedom about these issues, and somebody who's now with us in Vienna while also teaching at Yale, this whole issue of a polarized society where politics are angry and divided, not only in the US, but in many other countries, with a president who cozies up with the toxic males, as my colleague Shalini Randeria would say, the Erdogans, the Putins, the Xi Jinpings, the Kim Jong-uns. How do you see the effects of what is going on? Is there an interaction? Is there a kind of a feedback loop between the populists and the kind of authoritarian tendencies in these leaders?
So first of all, thank you very much for the possibility to speak with Raimund Löw and Stephen Erlanger and Ambassador Nowotny. It's a great pleasure. I'm struck that I'm here with people that I've been reading for a very long time, and I'm also struck that I'm here with Europeans who have lived in Washington D.C. much longer than I have. So it's a pleasure. Let me try to take that question at a number of levels. First, I'd like to take a step back and try to define what is different between Europe and the United States in about 50 words. I think what's at stake is the big question of modern Western history, which to my mind is, what do you do after empire? And the European Union has a story about itself, which is we're about the war, we learned about peace, and so on. That story is nonsense. What the European Union is really about is where you go after empire. Where does the Netherlands go after empire? Where does France go after empire? Where does Germany go after a failed imperial war for Ukraine, which we call the Second World War? That's what the European Union actually is. It's an answer to the question, where do you go after empire? The United States today faces the same question, and it's giving a different kind of answer. The European answer was something like, we forget about our imperial history, we create a big trade zone, we start a new story about ourselves, and we support democracy. The American answer under Mr. Trump is something like, we talk even bigger about ourselves as imperialists, even as we pull back from the world. We turn the imperial rhetoric against our own people, turning the us and them of imperial world politics into an us and them of domestic politics. This, I think, is the broad way to understand the difference between what's going on, or at least it's one broad way. And I think we have to have broad ways of thinking about this, because if we just think about Trump and so on, we're not going to get our mind around what's actually going on. The second point I want to make more directly in response to Yvonne's question about influence is just to remind us that the influence isn't always from America to Europe. I mean, there's a certain pattern on this continent of kind of leaning back and asking, well, you know, what can we blame the Americans for now? Or, you know, what surprising thing is about to happen in America that we can then reflect upon and, you know, not do very much about? And that's a posture which I think is fundamentally at odds with reality. I mean, to be very clear about this, to all the evidence, Donald Trump would not be president of the United States at all if not for Europeans. I mean, not you personally, but Europeans, I mean, I don't recognize anyone, but maybe it's up there where it's dark, but Europeans in St. Petersburg and Europeans in Moscow had an awful lot to do with the election of Donald Trump. There's a very smart political scientist called Kathleen Hall Jamieson who has written a very careful book about how the Russian leaks of emails and the Russian social media disinformation probably tipped the balance in the states that mattered in the 2016 election. Now, that may not be the kind of European influence on American politics that we want to think about, but it's real, and it's going on again in 2020, and it points to larger questions that underlie both developments here and in the US. Questions, first of all, of oligarchy versus democracy. One way to think about the US and Europe is that we are the trends that you should watch out for. Just as if you're in America looking at Russia, you can say the same thing. Those are the trends that you should watch out for. Oligarchy is that trend. The United States is what a democracy, a post-imperial democracy looks like with radical inequality. So the second underlying trend is digital politics. Trump certainly would not have become president if it weren't for the fact that Americans spend on average 11 hours a day in front of a screen. So, it may or may not be smart to be having this debate during the coronavirus, but at least you're not staring at your phones, which is cool. I mean, most of you. In an era of digital politics, that's another thing where Americans have gone further down a certain road than Europeans have, and these are some underlying trends. A third thing that I want to point to about Europe, it's maybe not so obvious with respect to Europe and the United States, is how we think about Trump, or how we should be thinking about Trump. I mean, as Shalini Randeri and others have pointed out, Trump is very similar to a number of people in the global South. However, Americans are more comfortable comparing him to Europeans for whatever reason. So when one tries to think about where Trump is in his political life, the analogies that one comes up with are things like Francisco Franco or Vladimir Putin. That is, the authoritarian whose main aspiration, at least at this point in his career, is to die in bed. And when we think about where American politics is and what's actually going to happen on November 3rd, that's the fundamental thing to keep in mind. We don't have an authoritarian political system entirely yet, but we do have an authoritarian in power who faces the basic authoritarian dilemma, which is if you leave office, you can go to the poorhouse, right? Trump is not a successful businessman, whatever the Chinese might have thought in 2016. He owes $500 million, which means that, congratulations, every single one of you is $500 million richer than Donald Trump, right? So buy yourself a drink afterwards and congratulate yourselves. But Mr. Trump also is under investigation for crimes which he did commit. So if he's not president of the United States, his choices are prison and poorhouse. And, as he himself said the other day, Russia, right? So those are the places that he might go, which means that this is not an ordinary election, it's a fight to the death. And when one is looking at it from a European point of view and imagining how the next few weeks are going to play out, one has to remember that it's not just about November 3rd and will all the votes be counted. It's also about the fact that we have someone who, regardless of how badly he gets beaten, and I think he's going to get thrashed, regardless of how he's going to get beaten, how badly he's going to get beaten, he's going to resist. And our ways of thinking about that are European. And then the final thing I would want to say about this is that Trump does have a Europe. As Yvonne correctly suggests, he does have a Europe. It's not this Europe. It's not the Europe of the Burgtheater and debates and people come out on Sunday mornings. His Europe is Orban. His Europe is Putin. That's his idea of the right kind of Europe. It's a kind of mutated, exaggerated version of this new Europe, right? The authoritarian Europe is the right Europe. That's the normal Europe. That's the way things should come down. So I'm going to close this with a bit of an appeal, which is, even if we take the posture of asking what's going to happen in the U.S. from Europe, we may be making a big mistake. I mean, as Stephen Erlanger pointed out, the European economy is much bigger than the American economy. There are ways that you are much more powerful than the Americans, but the way that you hold yourselves back precisely in Germany and in Europe in general is by saying, well, before we have any kind of discussion, let's check and see what the Americans are doing or what the Russians are doing. It seems to me that in Europe, what one ought to be doing is realizing, okay, Biden's probably going to win. There's going to be an unbelievable soft spot in early 2021. because as Stephen Erlanger says, they're thinking only about domestic policy. If there were some smart Europeans who had a proposal for a new partnership with America and could draft that in the next couple of months and present it to Biden in February of 2021, we might get somewhere. So I just want to lob that out there as a proposal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim, for taking that step back and giving that broader picture as well. And clearly, as some of us who are or have been in the think tank world know, that a number of such policy papers have already been written or are being prepared. Steve, you reminded us of the way that the U.S. helped rebuild Europe, of course, the Marshall Plan, and then the U.S. security umbrella under which the European Union was possible. I mean, Germany and big countries didn't have to invest in armaments. You know, the U.S. did the defense spending. And so I'd like to come back to you, Eva, now with, of course, that infamous or famous quote by Bob Kagan in his book that, you know, Europeans are from Venus and the U.S. is from Mars. That made a big splash whenever that was, about 10 years ago. How just reflect on that from where we are today, and given what Tim said, and let me just add the obvious banality that the transatlantic relationship, if we just take the economic terms, is humongous. It's trillions of dollars exchanged. The relationship between Europe and China, or US and China, is nothing comparable to the huge economic flows, to the number of jobs that Europe creates in America or the US creates in Europe. So that has not really changed. Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about taxing BMWs in the US and various cars, and, you know, champagne and camembert in the US. So clearly, that is a kind of mainstay that we forget about. It's still there, but there have been the very ruffled feathers on the political side. So Mars and Venus, where are we today?
Yeah, before I come back to that, I would like to take up two things that were coming out of the discussion now. I mean, first of all, what Raimund said about the strengths of the American media. We saw yesterday a section of the New York Times which was devoted to a position of the editorial board about a verdict on this administration. And I have to say, it was the most devastating document, the most devastating verdict on an administration that I've ever seen. Incredible. The question, of course, remains who is going to read it and how far does it penetrate into the thinking of those people who are surrounding Trump in unshaken believers? Yeah,
well, it's
almost as, yes, but it's the second thing is, and I'm very glad that you mentioned the strengths of the transatlantic economy. Because this is something that is usually ignored in the public debate, but this is of a size which is incomparable to any other economic relationship in the world. Yeah, and I'm not talking about trade, although trade is huge. Yeah, but about foreign direct investment, about the millions of jobs that are that Europe guarantees in the United States guarantees in Europe. That's of a proportion that puts into the shadow every other economic relationship that exists, and shows that if you add to that the cultural ties, the human ties, and also the political ties out of our common history that unite us, you almost have the feeling that you are talking already about one region. And that makes sort of what has been happening in the last 4 years particularly difficult from a European position to understand. When it comes to sort of the big issue of security, of course, I mean, that goes without saying and has to be acknowledged. We have lived very comfortably under the American umbrella for the last 70 years. I mean, this is As a result of the Cold War situation, is a result of sort of contemporary European history, but it was a very comfortable position for the Europeans to be in. Although, and here I would like to qualify, one should not ignore that also the Europeans have had their contribution, perhaps not as massively as the United States would have wished, but we did our share. Now, Austria is not a member of NATO, although we have sort of what the Ministry of Foreign Affairs proudly calls a tailor-made relationship, whatever that is. But sort of, I assume it means that we do whatever we can and out of our own decision-making without being tied into too many other provisions. But we have done our share in international peacekeeping. We have participated also in European security operations, and so the burden sharing is perhaps not totally equal, but it should not be ignored that Europe has also done its share. And when it comes to this comparison by Robert Kagan, I mean, it was always good for headlines and for articles, yeah? But we should not ignore the fact that we have also European countries who were very quick in military response. Think of the decision of Great Britain to go into war about the Falkland Islands. It was a decision from one day to the other, yeah? The French are very ready to go into operations in Africa, in West Africa, or now in Libya and so forth. So that's it's not all Venus. It's not all Mars either, but it's not all Venus also.
I'll give Tim the floor just as you mentioned this. I remember my colleague at the German Marshall Fund, where I spent 6 years in Washington, who had been Assistant Secretary for International Security at the Pentagon. He said that he was speaking more often to the French military over the whole Western Africa, Mali, than any other country. So you're right to point out that it's not as simple as Mars and Venus. Tim.
Quickly on the 2 points that Ambassador Nowotny raised, on media, it's the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Guardian and other national newspapers have done a wonderful job. And from this distance, it's easy and proper to admire them. But if you're a European worried about how something like Trumpism comes about, there's another level of media which you should be looking at, which is the local media. The local media matters more than the national media. And when the local media goes away, then people are vulnerable to social media, they're vulnerable to polarization, they're vulnerable to conspiracy theories. That's the history of the United States in the last 20 years. Most of the territory of the United States is now technically a news desert, which means that people do not have reporters telling them about the things that are happening where they live, which means that it's very easy to polarize people on issues which are not directly about them, but are ideological in nature. So if you're a European trying to head off this kind of polarization, you know, the Norwegians and others have the right idea. You have to get behind local media actively and treat it as a positive good and not leave it to the whims of the market. I can't resist talking about Mars and Venus.
Okay.
I mean, the first thing to be said is that the one reason that Bob Kagan is wrong, a very smart man whom I respect, but one reason he's wrong is that the Europeans fight wars left, right, and center. They just fight, like everybody else, they fight them until they lose them. I mean, this is the thing that you lose in your story of the European Union. The story of the European Union is we lost the Second World War, we realized war was bad, and so on. No, you lost the Second World War and then you kept fighting wars until you lost them. The French lost in Algeria, they lost in Indonesia. The Dutch lost in Indonesia. You keep fighting wars until you lost them and then you forget about them, right? And that's the difference between the Europeans and the Americans is that you lost your wars about 3 decades before we did. Now we're losing our wars, and so we're where you were 3 or 4 decades ago, and we're facing this question of what to do after empire. But the whole idea that Europeans are Venus is just absolute nonsense. And then the second thing I wanted to say in this connection is I don't think the U.S. role in Europe, although I broadly approve and agree with what everyone has said, can be seen as entirely innocent or altruistic. It helped the United States to become a power to have these relationships with Europe, and I think in the 21st century, the United States doesn't have a chance of dealing with China unless the United States has a positive relationship with Europe. So the American habit of saying, you know, Europe is some kind of dependency on us is obviously wrong. We are not powerful enough to deal with the world without Europe, and that's one of the lessons of the Trump administration, right? Because of the way we've dealt with both Europe and China, we've let the Europeans get closer to China by being hostile to China, ignoring Europe, and that's been a huge mistake. But the final thing about Venus and Mars, I mean, I think there may be a little bit of cross-dressing going on here as well. When Steve was talking about, you know, how America, you know, is hesitant to spend all of its money defending Europe, okay, but our military budget is still $700 billion a year, right? And the funny thing about the Trump administration is that we keep spending more on the military while doing less with it. Right? And what exactly is that? I mean, is it a militarist pacifism or is it a pacifist militarism? And you know, this whole, that you spend more and more on the military while threatening your allies. That's been our foreign policy. And so what I want to suggest is that the Trump administration is actually Venus dressed up as Mars.
Just a very quick footnote to what you have just been saying, Tim. As we are sitting here in the Burgtheater, it might be good to remind us that Austria is the country that for 200 years has lost every war we were involved in.
On that unhappy note, I'll give the floor to Steve. And Steve, I'd like a rejoinder, and before we go to Raimund. A lot of the kind of think tank bubble in Washington, the Kagans, the Atlantic Councils, say that the U.S. needs to recreate its role. They don't say as the world's policeman, but really to have the upper hand in and giving guidance in solving international problems. Where are these people now? And I mean, what's their way of thinking after the Trump experience?
First, I just want to say very briefly what Tim said about local media is so true. It's a disaster, and Facebook is one of the reasons, and we shouldn't forget it. I mean, Facebook and Google has basically eaten all these newspapers' lunches, and it's a problem, and it makes us more important than probably we should be. I mean, we have more than, I mean, I don't want to talk about the media other than that, but we have nearly 6 million people now who are paying for us every day, and that's fine, that's great. I mean, it's wonderful, it means we can live.
It's much more than a couple of years ago, no?
Well, it's enormous, but part of it is the lack of anything else.
The need, yeah.
Yeah, so, and that is not a good thing. Look, I think, you know, I've been trying to write about what a Biden presidency would mean. I mean, this is putting a hostage to fortune. I was someone who 4 years ago said that even Hillary Clinton could beat Donald Trump. And I was wrong, of course. And so I remain very uncertain. I mean, I think Tim's right, but our system, you know, the Electoral College, it's a hostage to fortune. However, I think too many Europeans will think of a Biden presidency as a warm bath in the past. And the fact is the world has changed, China's changed, Russia's changed. Those things have had nothing to do with Donald Trump. But a vacuum, if you like, of American leadership, call it leadership, has meant what I see as a kind of rise of almost neo-imperial regional powers, people like Erdogan, people like Putin, people like Xi Jinping, who are doing basically whatever the hell they want in their regions with very little restraint. And I think this is going to be a big, big challenge because what you do with Erdogan, given his crucial importance to European security, to NATO security, is one of the great questions. He's like the elephant in the room. But it will look wonderful in the beginning. There'll be nice words said, there'll be summit meetings, there'll be talk of alliances and multilateralism and, you know, blah, 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 blah. But there is already a nervousness that the deep polarization of American politics has meant the end of consistency in American foreign policy. It used to be, you know, that politics, in the cliche, stopped at the water's edge, that there was a kind of bipartisan American foreign policy that you could rely on. That's no longer true. And if you look at a Biden who will be 78, he's likely to be a one-term president. Tom Cotton could be the next president, a different kind of Republican who works on Trump's base. Things could shift again. So there will be a kind of risk avoidance, I think, on the part of some European leaders to give Biden what Biden thinks Biden wants and deserves. And we'll see that with China. We'll see it in a lot of ways. There's also a real concern, whatever you think of this idea of European strategic autonomy, which Emmanuel Macron, in a very Gaullist way, is pushing. You know, he's doing it in the context of a Trump administration that's been described very, very well here, where Europe could have a stronger voice, should have a stronger voice, could speak, in Josep Borrell's words, the language of power, where Sigmar Gabriel says we can't anymore be a vegetarian in a world of carnivores, but I'm very doubtful. And the worry people have is that Biden will be a great excuse for people to put their heads back in the sand. And this will fall apart. And that's, I think, part of the anxiety. I mean, it's harder to say no to Biden than to Trump, that's for sure. But I think people are going to hedge their bets considerably. And then, of course, we have all kinds of divisions. I mean, New Europe, Old Europe, I mean, fine, the Americans try to do this, but Europe is doing a good job of dividing itself without our help, frankly. And this is a great problem that nobody in Brussels really wants to talk about because they don't know how to deal with it, to be honest. So, you know, there's very interesting things to see. If Trump wins again, frankly, you know, we'll see. It's very hard to know since Trump doesn't actually have a strategy. Trump has instincts, and he moves from thing to thing. If you read John Bolton at all, that's the one truth that comes out of John Bolton. There's no coherent pattern to Trumpism, except a kind of need to be praised and a need to seem important and so on. I don't know. I mean, I think we all face, I mean, it's banal, but China's a very different kind of rival. It's a regional rival. It doesn't have global aspirations in the same way. It doesn't have ideological aspirations in the same way that a Soviet Union did. But it is engaged in the world, and it is an enemy of the current multilateral order. It wants to alter it. It wants to create its own. It wants to have a voice that the rest of the world so far really hasn't wanted to give it. And how one manages the rise of China, I think it's not Mars and Venus, it's just a joint problem. It's a joint issue for all of us in the West who have a certain kind of open economies, open political systems, believe in some sort of fairness. What do we do about the World Trade Organization? That's a joint problem. You know, what do we do about climate change? We need China for climate change. China and India create 40% of the world's carbon. I mean, you all could go home and heat your tea with your breath, and the world will end. unless China and India change their policies. So this whole idea of this confrontational world, it makes no sense. I mean, there are problems that don't have borders and problems you can't build walls against. And I think at least the Biden administration coming in will understands that, at least intellectually. The question is what together we're all going to try to do about it.
Well, we're sort of coming to the last chapter of this discussion, and I'd like to go to you, Raimund. And Steve has already addressed or mentioned some of the issues that I would like to tackle as we go into these last 20, 25 minutes. There's been talk about this possibility of a Biden administration, and someone read an article yesterday was talking about that he will take a posture of what this person called planetary realism. To put it in a few words, it means he will condemn China on its human rights policies, but he will engage them on climate and pandemics. So that's the realism element. And would you agree with Steve, although it was a bit paradoxical what he said, China doesn't have global ambitions, but at the same time, as we all know, it doesn't want to repeat a history of opium wars where it's on its knees. The whole Huawei issue that has taken salience, where America is really making it part of its policy to ask countries. Pompeo made a trip around Europe asking European countries to sign on the dotted line that they wouldn't take in Huawei. How do you see this, both planetary realism possibility and, is China, as Xi Jinping announced at that party congress several years ago, basically saying we want to, dominate the world?
Well, the identity of the Xi Jinping leadership is China that looks outward, and that's a difference with the former prevalent ideology. I think Xiaoping has been famous for saying, well, let's try to act modestly, to speak modestly, so that on the international level, so that nobody realizes how strong we are getting internally. So this time is over. Xi Jinping's ideology is we are strong outside and inside, and we want to be recognized as being strong outside. We want to be recognized as part of the big powers of the world. I don't think that the Chinese want to overthrow the international system the way it exists. The Chinese are ready to participate in international organizations, but the Chinese want to change the relationship of forces on the international level. And that's always complicated, and that's always dangerous. And there's the Harvard historian Graham Allison, who wrote a book on the Thucydides trap, meaning that in history, if there is a dominant big power that's challenged by a newcomer, these situations very often end in war and end in conflict. And there is a debate in the US as well as in China if we are not in a similar situation. Obviously, this is, in my view, going to be the dominant theme of the 21st century. The question of war and peace is going to decide between the US and China. This is going to be the dominant question of this century. In order to make it possible that this kind of competition does not end in armed confrontation, you need an international system, you need international agreements, you need international organizations. And here's the big problem of Trumpism. When you try to weak or destroy all these international systems, you create a stronger confrontation between the big powers. And the Huawei case you mentioned is very clear. This is not about trade. This is about geopolitical competition, and this is about the question, does the American administration wants to get into a Cold War of a new style with China and get the Europeans into an alliance of a Cold War 2.0. Let me come back to the question of the media, because it's, of course, completely correct what you said. You have not only the local media in the US disappearing or being weakened. You have right-wing radio shows, very, very, very important. But the fact that you have a debate like the one in Savannah Guthrie in Miami, where the journalist is confronting the president numerous times, is calling his falseness false. This is seen by Chinese. This is seen all over the world, and this is an example of how one could. You don't have to deal with this with a Trump that way, but you can. And this is the difference between the U.S. and the strength of social civil society in the U.S. You don't have a New York Times in Poland. You don't have a New York Times in Hungary, where the dimensions are a little bit different, but still, I mean, the fact that you have this kind of civil society, the strength of civil society, is an aspirational element of the complicated American situation. America creates international trends. That's still, I think, a sign of strength of America, that in political international trends very often start in the US. And these are not only the trends of the people in power, but also the trends of the people on the street. And we have the Black Lives Matter movement in the US in the last couple of months, which was a humongous movement going beyond the traditional activists of against racism, being supported by a big part of the American society. And we saw Black Lives Matter demonstrations suddenly coming up all over the world. We had the biggest demonstration in Vienna after the lockdown was a demonstration in solidarity with the American Black Lives Matter demonstration against police violence. And this, for me, is something that is a sign that the tradition of the American capacity to self-correct is still there and is seen in the world. And you mentioned 1968. So when I saw the demonstration in Vienna, I wanted to go to the American embassy. I remember 100 years ago, not 100, but 40 years ago, there were many, many demonstrations trying to get to the same American embassy in Portsmouth in solidarity with Vietnam and against the Vietnam War. And there were all kinds of radical slogans, and some people even burned American flags. And these demonstrations were labeled in the press anti-American demonstrations. It's completely wrong, because the burning of the American flags was taken from the students from the anti-war movement in Kent, in Berkeley, and in the US. There's been a big debate if you can burn American flags or not. The whole scenery of the student movement of 68 and afterwards was the words sit in, teach in. This was all coming from the US, and it is comforting sort of to say that the capacity of American society to react to this authoritarian trend in politics is still there, and it's also an international trend. Not only Trumpism is a trend coming from the US, but Black Lives Matter and other movements like that are also a trend. We see it in Vienna. I mean, in the US, there's been a big movement to, if one should keep statues of southern civil rights people from the southern state, from racists. Well, suddenly we have in Vienna a discussion about the Karl Lueger monument, which is not the first time this is discussed, but it's a discussion that is worth to have it, and a discussion that basically comes from America. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Certainly, there are congruences on these discussions about monuments. That's one of the many things that links up the events that have happened on both in Europe and the US. I'd like to come to a final round now, and we'll start with you, Eva. This European Commission has self-proclaimed itself as a geopolitical commission. There have been efforts to beef up the military, the PESCO jargon about creating a joint command. There have been differences and choices and coalitions of the willing on that issue. President Macron, I think Steve mentioned it, has taken the lead. We like to say, when he's in the lead and then he turns around and there's nobody really following in this more proactive European policy, whether it's to strengthen European sovereignty or, take a clearer stance vis-a-vis some of these issues. There's the whole issue of the Middle East. Maybe we don't have time to go into that. Libya is a basket case, really a dramatic example of how there is a division on that poor country that is now suffering so much between the various factions supported by various grand nations. The question really to you is, do you think, no matter who wins, whether it's Trump, which will be more dramatic, or Biden, does Europe have within itself, first of all, has it sort of heard the alarm clock and woken up to the fact that it does need somewhat more autonomy? I mean, I don't think anyone is naive to think that Europe can go 10 steps forward. It is part of NATO, thus there is a joint security, but these calls also by Chancellor Merkel, who is outgoing next year, and President Macron in particular, and with the Brits leaving.
Yeah, I think what you have rightly said is that all the ingredients are there. Yeah, the ingredients are there. They are also incorporated in the Treaty of Lisbon. It could happen. The question is, the stumbling block in the European Union and the developments, decisive developments in the European Union, is the nation states. Yeah, and whether they will be ready to go along. That's the open question, and that's a question that has to be answered. It has to be answered in Europe. That it is possible, for instance, we have shown very clearly, for instance, in the Brexit negotiations, where in spite of national interests and significant interests, it was possible to maintain a coherent negotiating position of the 27 in a very difficult situation. So the possibility is there. Whether it's going to happen is an open question, which I cannot answer at the moment. But I wanted to take up something else, which you said. When it comes to foreign policy, there are certain key ingredients which are necessary. That's reliability, consistency, confidence. And without that, foreign policy is always in big trouble. And this is exactly what we have lacked for the last 4 years. And where there is now a big hope that under a Biden administration, even if it may not be sort of earth-shattering new developments, but that these things come back, that there is reliability, consistency. And the reason I'm rather hopeful is that there are lots of very competent and experienced people who are close to a possible Biden administration, who are now sort of in a holding pattern and just waiting to come back, who have been ousted from important positions in the State Department and in other organizations, to come back, and that in itself will be a very good development. I would also like to come back, as you said, that this is probably our final round, to something which Tim has said, and which poses, in my opinion, a very, very difficult question for Europe. What are we going to do if Trump resists the outcome of an election, and with all the possible consequences? And these possible consequences may be very heavy. Yeah, we know that there are lots of heavily armed militia going around in the country. Violence is never really out of the picture. And what is Europe going to do in that, if it really comes to a contested election and with a very belligerent possible aftermath? This is something where I think a lot of think is necessary, which hasn't happened so far. If we should be confronted with a second Trump administration, the big problem that I see is really then in the cohesion of Europe, because then the temptation will be very great for some of our member countries to make their usual pilgrimages to Washington, make their kotos, present the presence, and that can be very harmful for the future development of the European Union.
Thank you very much, Eva. Certainly, that question, which I'd like to now bounce off of Stephen, you're sitting in Brussels. We've heard a number of people saying from various capitals quietly over dinners or lunches that if Trump wins, this is a danger that Eva mentions, that this might lead to some countries, if not leaving, then certainly creating, taking up very different positions than what we would call a European mainstream. And also, Steve, if we do, as things look, have a Biden presidency, notwithstanding the issues that Eva mentioned that Tim will address, what do you think will not change beyond the cozying up that you mentioned already in a previous round?
So much to deal with and so little time, but
take your time.
Yeah, no. I have been in and out of Brussels for 15 or 20 years. The Euro crisis, lots of things. I remember when the Berlaymont had asbestos in it. You know, I was in Bruges when Mrs. Thatcher said, "I want my money back," blah, blah, blah. So I'm a big fan, in principle, of the European Union. But I do think its role as a model for others is gone. The world has moved on. That doesn't mean it doesn't have lots of value for Europeans, but a European Union at 15 worked in a way that a European Union at 27 simply does not. And I find in Brussels a reluctance to come to grips with that simple fact. The fact is, in Central Europe, we talk about universal values. I don't actually believe in universal values. I don't think the Chinese have the same values that we do necessarily on everything. I'm not sure that some of the countries of Central Europe who are still democracies have quite the same values either. I mean, the whole identitarian politics of a Trump, which feeds on anxiety about what is happening to the majority culture of a country, right? I mean, what is it to be a real American? What happens to, white Christian America? I mean, these are part of Trump's arguments. In a way, you see the same debate inside the European Union. I spent a lot of time in northeastern Poland trying to understand why the Law and Justice Party was popular. And it was really worth doing because people have a different idea of history, they have a different sense of identity, they look at Brussels as this secular, anti-clerical, gender-bending, liberal place that they can profit from, but they do not admire. And this is ignored in Brussels constantly. Why is Viktor Orban popular? It's not just that he has fixed the voting system. A lot of people vote for him anyway. And I don't think we think enough about this. So the other thing I want to say, which is really to the heart of your question, is, we still have a German question. It's the thing that we don't talk about but it sits there on the table. A united Germany is the most important, the most powerful, the most influential thing in Europe. And part of what you see with Macron is his desperate effort to find a different way of working with a Germany that supports French interests and German interests. Now, there are some younger Germans who believe with Macron that Europe needs to do more, that Germany needs to spend more on defense, that Germany needs to take more responsibility, more collective responsibility, and stop using the Nazi past as a pretext for doing nothing. Okay? I mean, this is the standard problem, but it persists. And we're in the end of a Merkel period. Merkel has been incredibly important, particularly in the last 6 months when she's kind of revived with the virus. She's played an incredibly important role in leading Europe and in accommodating a France that wants more. She's figured out how to deal with Macron. She doesn't like Macron. They don't like each other. They're very disappointed with one another. Merkel hasn't responded the way Merkel hoped she would to Trump, and Macron has said and done things without consultation with the Germans that have really annoyed her, most recently in the Eastern Mediterranean, but lots of other places. So, to me, as I look at Europe, it spends a lot of money on defense, frankly, but very inefficiently. There are new efforts with PESCO and the European Defense Fund to at least begin to make that better, but of course those exactly were the things that were cut in the latest 7-year budget, right? So one does have to really wonder how serious Europe is about walking the walk, as we say, as opposed to talking the talk. But I remain open-minded, optimistic. I'm not a big fan of European foreign policy because it's too divided, and Josep Borrell's a good guy, but I don't know who he's speaking for half the time. When you have so much trouble getting sanctions on Belarus, it does make you wonder how efficient the European foreign policy is. So what does Europe do if there are problems in the United States? I think there's nothing it can do except hope and pray. And I do think, in general, and it is worth saying this, we've talked a lot about the extremes in America, there is a basic understanding in America that Europe matters, that Europe are our allies, that NATO is important. You have in Congress complete bipartisan support for NATO. There are businessmen all over America who understand the importance of Europe. There's also a bipartisan agreement that China is a problem, so we're all going to have to deal with that. But in general, I'm not terribly pessimistic about the alliance. If Trump wins again, I think, as I say, certain bets are off, but no one's pulling out of NATO. That's not going to happen. It would be nice to have him kind of support European integration if he's supporting European defense spending, but that's a contradiction in his own head that he's never resolved. And with Biden, I fear you're going to have a lot of happy talk and yet pressure, very much pressure to come together on WTO reform and on China and things that may be a little uncomfortable for European businesses. But that's the pleasure of politics. We'll see.
Absolutely. Raimund, what are your views on a possible Biden presidency? What stays the same, what changes?
Well, basically, I agree with Stephen's point that there will be a certain amount of time where foreign policy will be on the back burner, and the American system is going to set itself up in a new way. But Trumpism is not going to go away. I would really warn from this idea that if Biden wins the election, the problem of the 40% of American citizens who think Trump is right and Trump is defending our interests will disappear. These people are on the street. These people had a political leadership, and this is a revolt against the establishment. And the revolt against the basis of the revolt against the establishment is the consequences of globalization, the consequences of the growing economic disparities, and this is not going to go away. The pandemic will make it more difficult to get into growth mode again for the economies all over the world, and the fact that you have a important part of society in the most important country of the world being in a extremist right-wing mode is new, and the whole world has to cope with that, and it will not disappear with the Biden presidency. I want to come back also to Europe and Merkel. You're completely right. Merkel was an element of stabilization that the continent needed. But Merkel, in all these crunch situations in Europe, tried not to go forward. I mean, let's remember the situation of the Euro crisis after Greece, after the Greek crisis, how the Germans for a long time prevented the European Commission to issue Eurobonds and to change the competence in the direction of Brussels. Germany was against it. I mean, Merkel is a politician who is very pragmatic and very serious, but she doesn't like vision things. And in a situation where the situation is dramatic, she likes to de-dramatize, and that's not always correct. I mean, the European, what happened in Europe in the last 10, 15 years, the Chinese, to come back to the Chinese position, at the beginning, when the euro was established and the euro worked, the Chinese thought, okay, here we have a currency that may be a reserve currency similar to the dollar. We may want to invest in bonds and diverse our investment. Then they realized, well, euro bonds don't exist, because there are bonds denominated in euro, but linked to the different nation states. So rather disappointment. And then came Brexit, and which was a big disappointment. I think the Chinese sort of gave up on Europe being a world actor in the way this European Union works. And the reason why this happened is nationalism. You had in the last decade a renationalization of European politics. And this is not linked, this is not restricted to the far right or to right populists. I mean, if today we have in Austria the People's Party as well as the Social Democrats, I don't know if they're really pro-European, I have to say. Yeah. In some instances, yes, but if you have the message, if you follow the message closely, Brussels usually is bad. Whatever comes from Brussels, we are glad if we can stop it and prevent it to happen here. And this is not the case in Germany. In Germany, the CDU is different. It's the case in Italy. It's the case in other countries too. So the renationalization of foreign policy thinking and of security thinking and of economic thinking prevents, I think, a jump in European cooperation, which would be needed in order to cope with global problems from migration to climate. And this is also not going to go away, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Raimund. Obviously, the renationalization issue, you're absolutely right. The impossibility to introduce qualified majority voting is a sign of that. And of course, Brussels bashing has been a favorite sport in all countries, no matter whether renationalization or not. Finally, Tim, the final word will go to you. And let me just preface it by quoting Fintan O'Toole, a famous Irish colleague, journalist of Steve's and Raimund's, who wrote an excellent book on Brexit. He wrote an article on the US saying, we've had all sentiments towards the US, positive, negative, etc. But kind of he said, I feel that the latest sentiment is a sentiment of pity for what is going in the US. Obviously, it's a much more complicated argument than that. But how do you see the unfolding towards a Biden, possible Biden 46th president, among the other things that you've prepared to say in your closing remarks?
That's the danger of giving us paper. I mean, if you put paper in front of a historian, he's going to write stuff down. So I was glad to hear you cite Fintan O'Toole, who's a very wise man and who he's written very intelligently about pain in politics. And I think you can't understand America today without understanding how important pain has become, pain and suffering and anguish and fear. And that underlies a lot of the American turn against democracy, is that we have not handled the existential parts of life as well as the Europeans have. It's not just that we don't live as long, it's that we worry more while we're alive. And we worry more while we're alive because we don't know where our pensions are coming from. We don't know where our kids are going to go to public school. We don't know what's going to happen when we get sick. And during the pandemic, it's not just that we die in greater numbers and at greater rates. It's also that I'm comparing the mood because I went from one place to the other in the middle of the pandemic. It's also that people are just angrier and more frustrated and just more uncertain about what this means at every level. And I think that's critical to thinking about the U.S. going forward. I want to address what Raimund said about the endurance of the Trump people. I think that's certainly true for the next few years, but I don't think the Trump people and Trump are exactly the problem. I think that the source of the problem, the deeper source of the problem, is that we have so much fear and anguish and so much suffering and so much unnecessary death. And I think a Biden administration with the Senate majority could actually change that, knock on wood. Because the interesting thing about America, and I'm looking for that uplifting note now, okay? The interesting thing about America is that, yes, there is this minority for Trump, but the majority against Trump is now millions of people bigger than it was 4 years ago. And that majority against Trump isn't just against Trump. You can also phrase it in a more positive way. You can say, this is a very large multiracial coalition in favor of democracy. And that, it's not just a matter of being against, it's actually something which can be seen as immutable, right? So Raimund mentioned Black Lives Matter, which from a distance, if you just watch TV or see the pictures, you could get the wrong idea. I mean, Black Lives Matter was 68 has been mentioned a number of times. Black Lives Matter was probably bigger than 1968 in terms of the number of people who participated. Black Lives Matter wasn't just Portland and New York and Minnesota. Black Lives Matter was in every single state and in localities where everybody is white. It wasn't just a few big cities and a few burning cars. And the majority of the United States actually was in favor of Black Lives Matter, which is a striking difference from a few years ago and the same movement and the same slogan. So there is that America, and that America is bigger and I think more confident than it was 4 years ago, and maybe a little bit angrier, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Which leads me to the question which Ambassador Nowotny, I think, very shrewdly raised about how Europeans react to a Trump victory. And I think here we have to distinguish between two different kinds of Trump victories. So there's the possibility, inshallah, that he wins the election. That is a slim possibility, but it's not impossible. I mean, I would give it about 15% that he actually wins the election. Then the other way that he can stay in power is that he stays in power. He loses the election, but what I'm saying now is I'm just reciting what Mr. Trump has already said. The interesting thing about Mr. Trump's coup d'etat is, like everything else about him, he says it out loud, right? There's one form of authoritarianism where you have to guess what they're going to do. In Mr. Trump's form of authoritarianism, he declares what he wants to do, and then you see if he can actually do it. But the tricky thing about that is precisely by saying he's going to do it, he disarms people. Because people think, oh, well, his followers say, maybe we should help. But others say, well, that's crazy, he's not going to do it, And we talk about how crazy it is rather than realizing it's actually an intention. But what Mr. Trump has said he's going to do is the following. He's not going to accept the result. He's going to declare some kind of emergency. He's going to hope that his followers create chaos on the ground. And then he's going to try to somehow get the Supreme Court to stop counting the votes, which of course has a precedent in American politics not very long ago, which is Bush v. Gore in 2000, where the Supreme Court actually did stop the count of the votes and actually did allow the Republican candidate who lost the election to win the election. So that is the scenario. And that is not Mr. Trump winning the election, it's Mr. Trump staying in power. So I think for European officials thinking about how to react to this, well, if he wins the election, then all you get to do is say congratulations. But if he stays in power, then you face the Belarusian scenario, right? Then you face the Belarusian scenario, and you have to say, do we actually have something? Do we actually have something that we want to say about the process of democracy here? So the optimistic note that I wanted to land on, though, I think I put my remarks in the wrong order, was that there is an America which might emerge after the elections, as colleagues have correctly said, not just in the form of Biden. The most appealing thing about Biden, and the thing I actually find touching about Biden, is that he knows his own limits. He knows he's not a Superman. He knows that he has to trust people around him. And some of the people around him are quite impressive. And I think there is a chance for a substantial change in foreign and domestic policy, which reflects a majority America, which is maybe more interesting and easier to talk to. I think that's very possible. And I hope Europeans are ready for the good possibility, because despite all of our reservations, it may actually be out there. So thanks.
Thank you, Tim. Tim, thank you very much for underscoring, I think, what those of us who follow closely what's happening, the fact that this is a movement for democracy and reinvigoration of American democratic institutions, and by the same token, kind of global democratic institutions. And I think that's what we're seeing. And as with Brexit and the Trump victory in 2016, I think a lot of, well, of course, the Brits won't get a second chance, is the fact that a lot of young people who didn't come and vote simply because they thought Hillary would win, that it was in the pocket, or that Brexit would never happen because who wants to leave the European Union, those people now in the United States are out there. The early voting, the mail-in ballots, they want to be sure that their voice gets heard, or whether we call it the silent majority or not, these people now have voice, and you can simply feel it even from out here. Before I thank the panelists, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out today in these Corona times of ours. It's really impressive and very touching for all of us to see that you have braved the viral elements that are out there. I apologize for overrunning the time, but I think it was worth it. I think we all want to spend a little more time with each other, whether on stage or with the audience. I think it was worth it. And so please then join me in thanking our panelists for their performance today.